My father would be as likely to quote, the Prophet Muhammad as he would quote something from the Jewish Torah. It's a world-changing war. It's apocalyptic, it's catastrophic, because fighting racism in silos that was invented by racism doesn't really make any sense.
We saw a lot of complexity and we thought that meant we were being humanized. But I think the white gaze just saw a bunch of natives shouting and screaming and killing each other.
And the consequences of this war, I don't know. I don't think any of us really knows what we're looking at. But I do know that none of it is good.
I was going to go there, but then I was not going to go there. And then
it's like, if you think this is good, then you've got low bar, let's just say. All right, do you want me to press?
Yeah, you can start recording.
We are now recording.
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Can we start? Are you going to count me down? Hi, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today with me is Rachel Shabi. Rachel, you're a journalist, an author, and a commentator, and you've recently published your book, Off-White, which is about antisemitism. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks, Rachel. It's been a while. We've actually been hoping to speak to you for quite a while, and you've been busy with your book, and now that's just out, and so we're going to be having this conversation. We're going to be speaking.
It's a real pleasure. We had a bit of back and forth, didn't we?
We did indeed. We're going to be speaking about a lot today. Obviously, we're going to be speaking about your book and anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment. Your book's called Off-White, so we'll naturally speak about whiteness, I guess. But also, obviously, we're going to speak about Israel, Palestine, and more intrinsically, we're going to speak about specifically how this war is possibly gonna and probably already has polarized global society and that ramifications. So just right off, we're speaking in the midst of this war, which is still ongoing. It's now 13 months. By the time this is published, it definitely will be 13 months. Just how significant is this unfolding war and why?
It's a world-changing war. It's apocalyptic. It's catastrophic. Primarily for the Palestinian people, for people in Gaza who are going through the most horrendous atrocities. And the scale of the death and destruction and terror and suffering and loss is truly incomprehensible, in the sense that I don't think we can really wrap our heads around the enormity of it. So first and foremost, for Palestinians in Gaza, it's a catastrophe that will play out for generations to come. The trauma of it will play out for generations to come. For Palestinians outside of Gaza, watching the erasure of their own people in real time on our screens, as we've all been watching, is an agony that I imagine is very hard to put into words, to describe that feeling of witnessing something that is so appalling and that we cannot seem to stop. And the consequences of this war, I don't know. I don't think any of us really knows what we're looking at. But I do know that none of it is good. I know that it is something has broken, right? Quite a few things have broken in the way that we understand the world and the things that we are not able to stop. And so what I can say that I feel really a sense of hopelessness and despair about is that the outcomes are going to be bad for everyone, whether we're looking at Palestinians, whether we're looking at Israelis, whether we're looking at people outside of that region. This is a world-changing and catastrophic event. Event is not the right word.
I mean, very much like 9/11 and the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. Soon after that, there was definitely a sort of a wave across the globe of Islamophobia, racism, polarization, and we've definitely been flung right back into that to a large extent. I mean, I know we're going to talk about this throughout the interview quite a bit, and we're going to come to your book immediately after this question. But just how do you see us healing from this moment?
Again, I think these questions are really difficult to answer when you're in the middle of something that is so enormous and horrendous. And, the moral imperative is to find a way to bring it, as in the assault, to an end. And of course, that end will be the beginning of something else, which will also be horrendous and long drawn out. For me, when I look at what's happened, it's hard to imagine any kind of healing without justice, without an acknowledgement of the scale of what's happened, right? And I'm not talking just about Israeli Jews undergoing a sort of societal reckoning with the scale of what's happened. I'm talking about globally, when we look at Western countries and the permissibility, the way that this has been unfolding on our screens for months on end. Every day we wake up to an atrocity in Gaza and now in Lebanon. The reconciliation, the acknowledgement, the engagement with justice, I think needs to happen on a much more global scale.
You are an Iraqi Jew. You grew up in Israel, and you've lived in the UK now for many decades. When did you want to start writing this book, Off-White, and when did you want to start writing it? What made you want to write it?
I actually grew up in the UK, so I arrived to the UK as a toddler, nursery aged. Hebrew was my first language, but I basically born in Israel and bred in the UK to Iraqi Jewish parents. I checked this the other day. I started talking to my agent about this in January 2022. And obviously it had been sort of rumbling, rattling around my brain for a while before then. And the reason I wanted to write it is it's become increasingly clear to many of us, I think, that the conversation that we're having about anti-Semitism is a battleground. It's a minefield. It's a dumpster fire. It has in common with other racisms against other racialized minorities the fact that our media and political mainstream cannot be trusted to have a conversation that is productive, meaningful, respectful, or even safe about anti-Semitism, much like as with other kinds of racism. And so it seemed clear to me that the conversation that we were having about anti-Semitism, whoever was leading that conversation, whether it was, pro-Israel supporters or people who are right-wing or people who are would count themselves as progressive anti-racist, the conversation was leading to less understanding of anti-Semitism, less engagement with anti-Semitism, at a time when it is actually a rising force, not just in terms of harms caused to Jewish people globally, but as a mobilizer, as part of a mobilizing agent in a far-right nativist ideology that is causing great harm to all of us and is leading to a resurgent far-right. And so I came to this book wanting to create something that would allow a different conversation to happen, not least a conversation that could reconnect engagement with tackling anti-Semitism, reconnect that to a struggle against other forms of racism and see it as necessarily interlinked and interconnected.
You said that anti-Semitism was being raised in a way that was creating less understanding of the issue. Just hone in on that for me. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I would say, I'm sitting here in the UK, and so my understanding of what I'm seeing is based around, British societies and Christian European societies, where clearly anti-Semitism, the societies are saturated with this form of racism. These societies are the origin story of anti-Semitism, and they are the origin story of other kinds of racism, certainly the racism that underpinned and informed slavery and colonialism and empire. And so I think that there is a basic low information in these countries about anti-Semitism and other racisms in general, where our starting point is low information. Okay. And then we have on top of that, the way that it is being discussed is seems mostly now to be commandeered by people who want to make political hay with it. So when we see it arise, it comes out with the right wing, make criticisms of the left wing for being anti-Semitic, whether that comes to in the way people talk about Palestine and Israel, or now it's actually expanded to be a critique of anyone who would self-define as being anti-racist. It's used to cudgel or make criticism of people who are, woke, inverted commas, or it's been used to attack diversity and equity programs. All of this is being targeted by a group of people or who have defined anti-Semitism as something that is primarily a problem from progressive left camps. And what that does, first of all, is it creates, a conversation that is based on rebuttal. Well, you claim that my criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. It isn't. You are trying to silence my criticism, my legitimate and necessary criticism of Israel's various and decades-old crimes against Palestinians, right? So that becomes the debate, an attack and a rebuttal. None of that has anything to do with actual anti-Semitism or actual Jewish people. It just becomes a sort of weaponized in this debate or this argument between left and right. And what's the uninvolved bystander supposed to make of this? What is the uninvolved onlooker supposed to make about the conversation we've had over the last year, where Israel and very pro-expansionist supporters of Israel will describe anything from the UN to, a Swedish climate campaigner, to various actors, to various DJs, to various British singers as anti-Semitic? What is someone who doesn't know much about the subject supposed to make of that? And so the result is just confusion and less understanding than there was when we began. And that seems to me to be a very, a really big problem, and one that we urgently need to resolve.
How far along were you in the book when October 7th happened? And how has the war that's unfolded impacted what you've written in the book and your plans and your vision for what the book would have been? Or has it not affected it at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. The book was commissioned in August last year. So it was a good few months before the terror of October 7 and before the terror of Israel's decimation of Gaza unfolded and is continuing. I think that all the themes that I wanted to look at in the book just became more pronounced and more urgent. So in the last year, we have, obviously, as you mentioned before, we've seen a global spike in anti-Semitism. We've also seen a global spike in Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, which we'll talk about. In the context of anti-Jewish hatred, we saw a global spike sprawling out on the streets. It's scrawled across social media. We've also seen this in overdrive attempt to silence anyone who's critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, anyone just crying out for this endless violence to stop, for this unstoppable killing machine, Israel's killing machine in Gaza, now in Lebanon, to stop. All of those people turning out onto the streets to protest, when all of those people are categorized as anti-Semitic. We've seen the way that it gets deployed to shut down critics of Israel go into overdrive. And at the same time, we've seen the far right, they're having a field day with this moment of crisis. Because on the one hand, we see all kinds of far right grifters essentially grift onto, fake concern for the Palestinian cause, and in so doing, mainline classic anti-Semitism. Or we've seen other sections of the far right who pretend to care, are very performatively caring about anti-Semitism, but at the same time might be anti-Semitic themselves, are performatively very supportive of Israel, and are using that essentially to mainline Islamophobia and to mainline an ideology that is anti-Muslim, anti-migrant, and a hateful nativist ideology that is a growing force across the Western world, and that we underestimate at our peril. And so you saw all these elements just become exaggerated over the last year. So if anything, it's made me see the need to change this conversation as being more urgent than it ever was.
Let's come back to you and you growing up in the UK as a Jew and an Arab, as you are Iraqi as well. Just tell me how you dealt with that identity, and also just how you dealt with specifically, I mean, being an immigrant, almost displaced like not you yourself, but your family, from Iraq to Israel and then Israel to the UK. Just what was that experience like for you? And what baggage did you end up having as a result of that?
It was very confusing. It was extremely confusing. I do remember, growing up in the UK, this was the 80s. And so, people, I guess, didn't really know what to make of us. People who are, black or brown and growing up in the 80s in the UK will describe and recall stories of just eye-watering racism, very clear anti-black, anti-brown racism that would show up in verbal abuse and would show up in bullying and physical attacks. And it would be, a childhood trying to reconcile and struggle and deal with that, right? This was the UK in the 80s. We showed up, people didn't really know what to make of us. It's like, wait, so you're Jewish, but you're also Arab. You're Israeli, but wait a minute, you're Iraqi, don't really understand, whatever, you're foreign, And so I think a lot of people who were growing up in the 80s during that time would be in that category of, we don't quite know what you are, doesn't matter, whatever, foreign, right? And so I guess for me, the cost of that, and this is the bit that I'm really sad about, is that it took me a while to register the richness of the heritage of my family, of my, Iraqi Jewish parents, because they, were displaced from Iraq and left in the early 50s, went to Israel. Israel at that time, they were part of a mass essentially a displacement of Jewish people from the Middle East. Israel at that time wanted to be, and still does, wanted to be European construct and saw Jews from the Middle East as being inferior and uncivilized. And then my parents showed up in the UK in the 80s where I guess, that was reinforced. And so for me, growing up in that environment, it took me a while to realize that actually, my parents were fluent in Hebrew and Arabic. And also, my father's case, fluent in French and Turkish. My mom grew up in northern Iraq, so she spoke Kurdish. They had this linguistic and cultural wealth. And I could see it around me as I was growing up, right? So it would be, world service first thing in the morning, world service last thing at night. But in between, they would be speaking Arabic between them. There would be Arabic music, all the greats, they would be talking about Arabic Egyptian cinema. They would be quoting Arabic poetry. There would be, my father would be as likely to quote, the Prophet Muhammad as he would quote something from the Jewish Torah. Like they were products of this cultural wealth. And regretfully, I guess because I internalized the inferiority that was being reflected back at me, it took me a while, like it took me into adulthood to register the cultural wealth that my parents had. And yeah, it's sad to think about now.
Tell me about their displacement from Iraq and what it meant for Arab Jews who were being displaced at the time from a bunch of Arab countries, and what it means for Arab Jews now.
Yeah, I think the the overarching narrative of that is that that period, when we look at that trajectory, that includes the Holocaust, that brought about or made a reality a Jewish state of Israel, that brought about a Nakba, and at the same time, this mass, as you say, displacement of Jewish people from the Middle East. The overarching narrative of that is that what we're looking at is all in some way, these communities all in some way tangled up in a legacy of European racism and colonialism, and it manifested in different ways and in different times. For Iraqi Jews like my parents, they had a unself-conscious, hyphenated identity as Arab Jews, and the competing nationalisms that arose during that period, both with Jewish nationalism in the form of Zionism, which, by the way, was not a prevalent force in Iraq and across many countries in the Middle East at that time. But that was competing with the Arab nationalism of nascent states that were trying to throw off imperial rulers, whether they were like, French in North Africa or, the British in Mandate Iraq. And caught between those two competing narratives, that hyphenated identity collapsed. It was not possible for it to survive that sort of pincer movement of competing nationalisms. And so that identity of an Arab Jew collapsed and disappeared from history, even as a concept. So now when you say Arab Jew, it's, it almost sounds like a misnomer, that's something that doesn't exist, even though it quite clearly was a category for many, many people for thousands of years. And that population, when it turned up in, the majority of those people did go to what was then, the nascent Israel, very beginning of Israel in the early 50s and onwards. That was a country that wanted to be European for many reasons. Zionism was a concept that was born as a response to European anti-Semitism, but it was also infused with European concepts of nationhood and racial superiority. But at the same time, those European Jews were escaping a anti-Semitism that had told them for centuries, you are not European, you are other, you will always be other, you are not part of this region. And so perhaps when they got to their own state of Israel, said, actually, no, we are European. Whatever the reason, the tangle of reasons, that obviously ended up with clear racist policies towards Palestinians, including ethnic cleansing and displacement and dispossession. Jews from the Middle East experienced it as a cultural whitewashing of a nation that, considered them uncivilized and backwards and too much resembling of what was now the enemy Arab neighborhood. And so they had to be sort of reconstructed in this image of an Israel that, despite being in the Middle East and despite being majority Middle Eastern, when you include Palestinian citizens of Israel, along with Jews from the Middle East, actually constructs itself as a Western and European civilization. And that is, of course, in part a colonial conception of itself as well.
What are your family's memories of living with this complex identity in Israel? And did it have anything to do with them leaving and coming to the UK, or is that just completely separate to it?
I mean, they arrived in the UK for a whole tangle of reasons, but they certainly do remember the sort of the disdain of their European Jewish co-nationalists at the time. My mother still remembers being sprayed with DDT on the plane on the arrival to Israel from Iraq, and they were constantly met with disbelief over having any kind of culture, or what, did you drive cars? Wait, you had flushing toilets? You listened to radio? Just all the basic hallmarks of people deciding that you're uncivilized. But I think, what's interesting about Israel is, yes, a lot of Arab Jews who got called Mizrahi Jews in Israel, they did internalize that, and they did reconstitute as, Israelis cast in a European mold. And at the same time, when you say to people, your culture sucks, you don't have a culture, you're backward and uncivilized, there's always going to be some people who will just quietly ignore you and carry on enjoying their culture in private, or will say, well, hang on a minute, who the hell are you to decide? And I remember interviewing people in Israel for my first book, which was describing this. And, I came across a Middle Eastern music producer who would, constantly clash with, the European Jewish dominated music industry. And he would say to them, who made you the arbiter of what culture is? Are you a musicologist? Did you study it? And so you're always going to have people who push back against that, which meant that, Israel, that culture has, against the odds, somehow survived. And you still see and hear traces of it in that country.
How then did the sort of the struggle for Palestinian liberation, which has always been in the background of your family's moving to Israel, and especially with your arrival, I guess maybe you're still very young, but I mean probably not. But your first arrival in the 80s, in when you're growing up in the 80s, it's when the Intifada breaks out. How then did your family already have some sort of attachment and feeling to the liberation of Palestine? Or was that influenced when they came to the UK, or influenced by the Intifada? Like, just what's your recollection of that?
Well, I always remember my father as being, he was always left-wing, including in Iraq, when he was much more sort of identified with Iraqi nationalism, right, than Jewish nationalism of Zionism, which actually was the case for the majority of Iraqi Jews at the time. And so I remember him as someone who had that as a sort of moral compass across several issues and actually across several languages. So we'd have a sort of geopolitical appraisal in many contexts that was imbued with the sort of left-wing principles. And yes, that manifested when it came to Israel and Palestine as well. I don't remember exactly when I got engaged in the subject, but I do remember that once I was engaged, and that was just part of being left-wing in the UK more than anything else, he and I would have many long conversations about it, and, share articles and, constantly be engaging with each other about the issue. And, so then he would narrate to me much more about his experiences when he did live in Israel, and, his response to 1967 and Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the Syrian Golan and East Jerusalem. He had a very strong reaction to that, and knew from day one that it was a disaster and objectionable. But I guess my understanding of it became much deeper when I was based in Israel and in that region, Israel-Palestine, while I was researching my first book. And then I was fortunate in that I was able to traverse between Israel and occupied Palestine, between Israelis and Palestinians. I was able to do that. And so I was lucky enough to be surrounded by experiences that would inform and educate me, and people who would talk to me about their lived experiences, both in the current day and historically. I have very vivid memories of, crisscrossing across the West Bank, first in like little buses, the sort of Palestinian transit buses that everyone uses as public transport, and then later in a, clapped out car, and just being exposed to the everyday violence of the Israeli occupation, and what that means and what that does, what that is as a reality. And I think, it's just very hard to unsee that. You can't unsee something like that.
This was like the late 90s, early 2000s, I'm guessing, when you were doing
This was
research?
2000s, so just in time for uh, the siege of Gaza
Okay.
following Israel's evacuation of
So it's just
settlements.
post the start of Iraq war before the Gaza siege starts.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Um, I mean, one thing we're also going to speak about, and I've already mentioned it, but I mean, you are Iraqi, right? And I mean, it's almost now something that's in the background. But the Iraq War was a very big, fundamental period in the modern Western, I mean, modern history of the globe, actually. How did the Iraq War sort of inform you and also speak to all of the identity sort of memory that you have?
Yeah. It still lingers, doesn't it? I, I I vividly remember, my parents being absolutely devastated,
Yeah.
just devastated, and constantly, glued to the TV and to the radio. And, they would articulate their despair in, it would be, they would constantly say, all these years of the British and the Americans, invading and then occupying Iraq, and they still can't pronounce the city names right. It would just be indicative of their sort of outrage and frustration and despair at the situation. And it did make me re-examine and want to know much more about them as Iraqis. And so just get much more insight and engage with them much more about that. But I mean, it's still catastrophic, isn't it? I mean, the consequences of that are just endless. It will run on and on and on. Not just, of course, primarily the devastation for Iraqis. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of whom have been killed, millions still refugees, a country that is hollowed out, an invasion that was illegal and left a security and governance vacuum into which flooded the worst faith actors, including, of course, Islamic State, from Iraq to Syria. The consequences of that for that region in itself were bad enough, but the consequences in terms of the permission architecture that set up. So the idea that the US-led coalition can just breach red lines in that illegal invasion, just trample over internationally upheld conventions, legal conventions around war, and say, nope, we're ignoring all of that. The consequences of that are devastating and will keep playing out, whether it's from countries that are defined as not allies of the West, or whether it's Putin's Russia or Syria's Bashar al-Assad, whether it is an ally like Syria and the devastation in Yemen, or now Israel and its decimation of Gaza and Lebanon. The permissibility architecture that enabled of, okay, there's no red lines, there's no international law, there's no protection of civilians, there's no such thing as a war crime. All these things were made permissible by that illegal invasion. And also the dehumanization that followed in the war and terror years. So in the decades after that, when Muslims and Arabs are construed as the enemy within, as people who are not to be trusted, people who are, dehumanized and denied the right to be seen as just regular folk with the same sort of regular dreams and hopes and fears as everyone else. That dehumanization is another permissibility, and we see the effect of that. We see the effect of that in the reality that what's happening in Gaza is allowed to happen every single day for over a year.
Of course, I mean, by then, I mean, we're speaking about the 2003 Iraq invasion, but I mean, we often, even that's so long ago and its memory still looms, but we forget that there was the 1991 Gulf War, and before that, there was the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq War, which was stoked and funded by the US also. So it's a country that's been devastated by three wars, really. Not to mention the ongoing. I mean, how do you even count the ongoing civil war, which flares in and out for the good part of a decade, and still leaves the country unstable. Just coming back to your book, there's a quote in it. I mean, I mentioned earlier before we actually started that I like the writing a lot. It's very, very powerful and very, very stark. And our audience will get to see a bit of it now. The history of Jewish people, you're right, the history of Jewish people in the West, persecuted, killed, and then finally absorbed into white majorities, is not only a story of anti-Semitism, it's itself a story about the fakery of whiteness. You kind of spoke a bit about this, not the last part, but you spoke about this earlier on when you mentioned how the displacement of Arab Jews from their Arab countries to Israel was brought about fundamentally because of European racism. And as a result, the movements of European Jews to Israel is also brought about by European racism, and the dehumanization of Palestinians, which creates the Nakba, is also brought about by European colonialism. Tell me specifically about what you mean in the sentence when you say it's itself a story about the fakery of whiteness.
So when I started to look at the history of anti-Semitism and trying to reconstruct an understanding of it as part of an ongoing evolution of different racisms that show up in different ways. Once you start looking at that, it becomes clear that the whole thing is a trajectory that is, of course, it's a construct, and lots of people who write about anti-Black racism and the legacy of slavery and colonialism and empire, and what that means for, the constructed category of whiteness, which is created in order to subjugate and enslave and colonize people who are not categorized as white. When you look at the history of anti-Semitism, though, what unfolds is it constantly informs and cross-pollinates with other racism. So you have its origin story in Christian Europe, where, even before we had a concept of race, we had a concept of a racialized other in the Jewish people who were demonized and vilified by Christianity, which at that time was a source of state power, and therefore it was structural. And then you have that setup of Jews as the scapegoat, the punch bag for rulers who, would give Jewish minorities just enough power that they could become the punchback in times of crisis, which is the architecture of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is essentially a conspiracy about power. And then you see how that evolves. So, you jump forward to the Christian Spanish reconquest of Al-Andalus in southern Spain, which was then under Muslim rule. And you see how they expand the concept of racism and racial purity with this idea of purity of blood. And the reason that they use this is because when they took over Spain, or southern Spain, they allowed Jewish people to basically convert or die. So a lot of them converted, and then Jewish people as Christians started holding state power. And the Christian rulers thought, well, obviously that can't happen because they're not white, right? They're not Christian, really. And so they invented this racial purity rule that allowed them to decree who was allowed to be, racialized as Christian and essentially white, and who wasn't, whether they converted or not. And then you see at that period, 1492, you see it jump over in the European Christian, again, conquest of the Americas. And so this purity of blood Ella Shohat, who's an Iraqi Israeli intellectual, writes beautifully across so many of these issues. She talks about the blood purity rule being used against Jewish and then Muslim people in Spain post 1492, creating an architecture of racism that could be used to underpin and undergird the enslavement of people in the Americas. And then you fast forward and you get the one drop rule in the 1600s, late 1600s in America, which was again used to racialize, subjugate, and control. And then you jump forward to Jim Crow, which is again based on this architecture of having essentially enforcing white supremacy in a post-slavery era. And then you jump forward to European colonialism. And then in the Nazi era, Hitler actually looked at America's structure of racism and was wondering if that would transfer and could be used against Jewish people in Germany, and decided not to go for the one drop rule, but went for a variant of it where, you know, having a Jewish grandparent would consign you to the death camps. And so what you see constantly is this cross-pollination, that racism is constantly in conversation with different kinds of racism, that it's always used in different ways by a category of people who have described themselves as white, who are Christian Europeans. And what's interesting is that in the post-war, post-Holocaust period, there was an understanding of that. We had these great intellectuals from Aimé Césaire, Hannah Arendt, W.E.B. Du Bois. They all understood that. They all looked at it and studied it and tried to connect those dots in our understanding of anti-racism. We somehow have lost that in the decades since, sometimes for understandable reasons, but I think there is now an imperative for the anti-racist left to try and reconnect those dots, because fighting racism in silos that was invented by racism doesn't really make any sense.
I mean, we are still living very much in the shadow of the colonial world, which was a power play of whiteness, right? And so it's a legacy of that. But just to sort of counter what you said, or just not counter it, but just to kind of almost play devil's advocate, but haven't all empires sort of weaponized race or identity? And we just happen to be living in the remnants, or very much still the time of the white empire.
Well, I think that when you look at the history of anti-Semitism and the racism that undergirded the enslavement of people and then colonialism and empire, I mean, you can see racism was specifically invented for that purpose, for purposes of control and subjugation. That took different forms when it came to Jewish minorities across Europe. But you can see that architecture is always there in play as a means of imposing the superiority of white Christians in those countries. So, and the legacy of that continues today. We are still very much living in that time. And I think the problem for us is that we have, because we're looking at this in silos, we haven't figured how to reconcile the picture that we're looking at today. So the picture that we're looking at today when it comes to Jewish people is one of absorption and integration into whiteness, right? In Western countries, certainly in America, where it's been the great success story, but also across Europe more slowly and less categorically, although there is always a contingency around it. But what we're looking at is essentially still Christian European countries othering Jews, othering Jewish people, but just doing it in a different way. And in a way that actually has nothing to do with, again, Jewish people or how they show up in the world or how they experience the world. I mean, nothing makes that so clear as this construct, this post-war construct of a Judeo-Christian heritage. I mean, what even is that? What does that mean? That's a heritage that was created in the post-war period in order to absorb Jewish people into the same Western countries that either were responsible for the Holocaust or did nothing to stop it, or did not allow Jewish people a place of refuge when they most needed it during the 30s and 40s, when you saw the US and the UK, for instance, bring about anti-immigration laws that were aimed at Jewish people. And so this construct of a Judeo-Christian heritage in that post-war period, who is that ultimately serving? It's serving Western countries in the way that they define themselves, right? And the way that they rehabilitate themselves in the aftermath of a Holocaust. And so the role that Jewish people are playing in that hyphen, which is then, by the way, used, the Judeo-Christian heritage that's then used to other people. And so it's used to other Muslims and Islam, which are outside that category and are not part of a Western civilization. Who is that construct serving? It's certainly not serving Jewish minorities. It's not serving anyone else. And so I think once we deconstruct what those things are doing, what are they created for, and who are they serving, I think that leads us to have a much greater and deeper and richer understanding of how actually we deal in this sort of post-colonial society with all the legacies of racism that we see all around us.
How has Western support for Israel's atrocities, and I'm talking about the atrocity from its very genesis when the Nakba occurs, and then its continued atrocities, how has it polarized Muslim and Jewish relations?
Well, where to even start with that one? I mean, I think what we've seen in the last year is obviously that's incredibly damaging. Okay, this sort of suggestion that there's a ancient hatred and enmity between two racialized minorities, and that this represents some kind of clash of civilizations when we can actually consciously trace a Judeo-Islamic heritage and civilization and coexistence, which I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, but it certainly existed and thrived and was an experience for thousands of years. So to erase all of that in service of a particular geopolitical configuration, I think is devastating on its own terms. I think what's striking about when you look at the current situation where, the atrocities that are unfolding in Gaza are making us all lose our minds, right? That it's so horrific. We wake up with it every day. And I think people will reasonably wonder, why is this allowed to happen, right? Why does Israel get to do this? Okay, and I think for Western, when you look at the US and the role it has to play in this, where you have the US president come over as, oh God, this is so difficult. I keep trying to persuade the Israeli prime minister to stop, but he won't listen to me. I'm getting so frustrated. And I think the peak ridiculousness of that came with that stupid floating pier that the US spent millions of pounds building in Gaza, right? To deliver aid. And it lasted for 20 days when it basically just was dismantled under the weight of its own stupidity. It delivered one full day of aid, I think. The idea that the US president cannot just say to Israel, hey, open up your borders now and let aid in, is so preposterous, but that we're encouraged to believe this, that we're encouraged to believe that the US cannot, with one phone call, stop this war, obviously is going to feed a conspiracy, an anti-Semitic conspiracy. Of course it is. Because then people start to think, well, why can't the US stop this? And so I think there's a fundamental dishonesty in that conversation that is fueling anti-Semitism, where, we can actually look at the US and say, sure, you're actually very happy with what your client state, Israel, that is, militarily funded and supported by you, is doing in this moment. One has to assume that, the neocon instinct of reshaping the Middle East that we saw in 2003 with that horrific invasion of Iraq is tantalizingly alive and well for the US political elite that reads in this moment another opportunity to carve out a new Middle East that actually doesn't mind if Israel degrades Hamas and Hezbollah, and obviously doesn't care about the civilian toll, that actually is benefiting from having Israel as a foothold in the Middle East, that actually gets all kinds of benefits, whether that's the military industry or security or surveillance or intel, that it actually is an asset, right? One has to conclude that. But rather than face the geopolitical reality of that, what we get from the US president is, oh, I'd like to stop it, but I can't, which to me is like the worst of all worlds.
I mean, your mentioning of the ridiculous peer, it just brings back a flood of memories that we've seen over this last year, and images of doublespeak by so many parties regarding this war. We kind of discussed this in our conversations before the interview. But I mean, we saw the horrible lies that built up the narrative of the Iraq War. And then when the US started, it was already destroyed Iraq to a large extent, but when it started implementing slightly better policies in order to get out, you started seeing a better narrative. The New York Times started to apologize for its, sort of blanket cover of Colin Powell statements. Throughout the 2010s, you saw sort of more woke voices in the big megaphones of Western journalism and journalistic outlets. You saw favorable coverage almost across the board, besides, the very far right of the Black Lives Matter movement, all of these movements. And I guess I did, and I guess you did too. You thought we're probably making a lot of progress as non-white people in a very white world. And then when you saw the immediate aftermath, and I mean it's still going on 13 months on, but the immediate aftermath of how an erasure, quite frankly, of the minute everything that was unfolding and October itself was covered, just how jarring was that for you, and why is it that you think so little was learnt?
It's such a great question, and I really would love to know what you think about that as well. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect that it's because the default in these societies, that are so saturated with racism, that are premised on racism, that it's so deep in societies as a sort of animating force waiting to be animated, and whether that's anti-Semitism or anti-Black racism or Islamophobia, that things default to that in moments of crisis because it is so readily available as an animating force. I guess that's the big part of it. And, I've heard other people who do incredible work in the field of anti-racism talk about this, of just how, we just keep needing to repeat it again and again and again and again. It doesn't ever stop. It's an ongoing thing, and it's a default. And so in this moment of crisis, and, of course, this didn't start with October 7, right? But that was a terror attack, and it precipitated something undeniably, right? In that moment, we could see everyone default. And I do think that for a lot of the sort of political and media elite, there's been a lot of failing upwards, right? I mean, there were zero consequences for people who did get it so disastrously, spectacularly wrong, the invasion of Iraq. A lot of people who made those horrendous mistakes that cost so much in human life are thriving now, have thriving careers, right? And so I think for that section of our media and political conversation that is still so dominant, it's tantalizing, and it's a default. This idea of reshaping the Middle East, of a civilizing mission, all of those things, all of those dumb tropes that essentially rely on racism are very much alive and well in our societies. But I really do want to know what you think.
I think we just underestimated how dormant and how powerful racism and humanization is. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I started getting involved in journalism very soon after the Iraq War, and during that period, what we saw was a lot of complexity, right? And the nature of the humanizing experience, in my view, is to show complexity, right? So you humanize people when you have interesting TV dramas about them and interesting novels about them, and the Arab world was going through so much in that period: internal war, the Arab revolutions, so much complexity, right? And
Yeah.
I think we both cover these events, and so we saw a lot of complexity, and we thought that meant we were being humanized. But I think the white gaze just saw a bunch of natives shouting and screaming and killing each other. And yes, they kind of cajoled the people they liked or the movements they thought were more civilized, but they never really fully understood or bothered to understand. And I just think that's it. And I think October 7th just kind of, and it's really strange because I remember I was not working at the time, and so I was just seeing that first month of coverage. I was just glued to every form of media, and I could only end up seeing Al Jazeera because it was just like it was the most jarring thing.
Yeah.
And Palestinians talk about this a lot. They talk about how to them, I mean, most likely pre the genocide they're seeing right now, but the biggest pain they have is the unacknowledgement of what's
Yes.
been done to them.
Yes.
And this was not being done to me not Palestinian, was being done to me as a human, right? But it's like seeing it was this complete erasure of acknowledgement of any real truth or sense of what's actually going on. And I mean, that's my best stab at an answer. But I just think we all, to a large extent, underestimated what a deep-seated gaze does to one. So even when you think you're being humanized, if there isn't real empathy yet, I don't know if you actually are being humanized. I don't know if when you show your complexity, you are actually doing enough to deconstruct racism. It's definitely helpful, but I just think I don't know. And then I think also a lot of it's just the October 7th Hamas atrocity, the extent that it was able to actually deal deadly damage to what is now seen as a white society was just a big affront and was just really visceral. And it was like, I mean, Norman Finkelstein's spoken about this a lot. It was just a very hard reaction. It's like a slave revolt. It was just, you need to put the native down. This was absolutely unacceptable. We have to do whatever we can in order to destroy them. I mean, it's very much like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I guess. The war's already won. Let's just show them who's boss. Let's go bomb a non-white participant in the war that's quite powerful. And I mean, I don't think the Americans never dreamed of dropping it on Germany, who were the big reason why World War II occurred, right? And that's just very indicative of whiteness.
It's so interesting. I mean, I think what you're saying about, essentially the idea that, you're bringing complexity as a way to humanize yourself through film and culture and music and literature is actually just a superficial thing that people aren't really without an understanding of structural racism, people are never going to translate that into an experience that allows them to humanize
Yeah,
people.
it's that,
Yeah.
and I think it's a projection. I think we see what we project, so we see complexity, but I don't know what the white gaze sees.
Right.
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 And I used to think they probably seeing complexity too, but now I don't know. And obviously, I mean, yeah.
No, I think there's something so interesting in what you say about, the need to crush Hamas after the atrocity of October 7th. I think that there's something going on there with, because you've created that sort of permissibility chain that we were talking about before. I mean, it's not just that Israel is a serial violator of international law, as we know. It's been given gazillions of green lights for decades, for constantly flouting and violating international law, and resulting in endless catastrophic wars, whether that's two, now three in Lebanon, whether that's Gaza, whether it's the constant violence of the occupation. Obviously, there has been a permissibility for Israel around that for a long time. But I think with this moment as well, because of the way that the whole war on terror narrative was allowed to intertwine with Israel. So Israel in that moment post 9/11 was able to say, hey, this is what we're fighting. We're not fighting a resistance movement against occupation dispossession. No, we're fighting the war on terror just like you guys. And the fact that that was so intertwined across decades meant that I would imagine, Western leaders who, we saw Iraq happen, we saw Afghanistan happen, we saw no one end up in The Hague after that happened, right? And so there's a bit of a thing of, okay, well, if we invaded Iraq after 9/11, then I guess these guys should, clobber Hamas for a bit. There's something about that intertwining of narratives that gave it permission as well.
No, absolutely. I think to a large extent, you talk about how the term anti-Semitism or calling someone anti-Semite has become reductive and useless. And in the same way, terrorism, the term has become reductive and useless. There's no such thing anymore. It's you pick your terrorists or you pick your non-terrorists just based on their skin color, what they're fighting for, and not at all based on what they actually do, whether they actually use terror as a strategy or not. That's just become what it is.
It does lead us to, when we think about our response, and of course it's impossible in the middle of this to think what next, but I guess that's the only thing we can come back to is, okay, are we going to believe in a shared humanity or not? Right? Are we going to create an international laws that apply to everyone internationally regardless or not? Right? That's the question. I think that's what is so terrifying. It's not just the terror of the atrocity and slaughter that Palestinians are experiencing. It's the consequences of allowing this insane breach of all the conventions of war, ones, by the way, that were put in place after the Holocaust for the specific reason of preventing genocidal wars, of preventing atrocities. And so, I guess that's what the fear is at the moment of, well, have we just collapsed this entire order? And what do we have left to hang on to, if not just a collective shared humanity,
No, absolutely. It does beg the question of if they do this, then they could do it to anyone, and
anyone else can do it as well.
Exactly,
that's the thing.
Exactly. There's just complete carte blanche. How do you envisage a way that Jewish people and Jewish society, the global Jewish society, can actually be safe? There was this experiment post the Holocaust, which I think was doomed to fail, called Israel, and many Jews do believe it's given them a sense of safety. But what's your thoughts on that?
I have many questions around the concept of failure and what was possible versus what actually happened. I don't think it was a foregone conclusion that we would end up where we are at all.
Walk me through that. Just what you explain that.
Well, okay. So if we look at, we have European Jewish people create a concept of Zionism that is a response to, centuries of anti-Semitism that actually would not have produced a state for Jewish people had it not been for not just the Holocaust, but the fact that Jewish people were not able to escape that to other countries. And so in the creation of an Israel in response to that, you could have had a nationalism that said, actually, you know what? Europe, screw you. We don't want to be a European construct. We want to be an anti-racist construct. We're going to go to the Middle East and we're going to live as Semites, since that's what you think we are, right? And we're going to do that with other people in that region, right? It's not a given that a project that is conceived as a reaction to racism will end up reproducing or recreating a different kind of racism. Right, that's kind of what I meant. Do you see what I'm saying with that?
I understand. It's almost like we're having a similar discussion with one of my previous guests. It's like the Israeli state came as crusaders and occupiers, and not as people who are trying to settle and be part of the land, and its people and communities. Yeah,
they came as both. They came as both, and now we're seeing the prevalence of that ideology in overdrive. You know, there's a national project and there's a settler colonial project, and the settler colonial project has continued but is now on full speed and in overdrive, right? What does it mean for Jewish people? I mean, it's such a complicated moment, I think, for Jewish people outside of Israel, in the sense of, you know, I think it's a moment of crisis in terms of disaggregating things that are actually intertwined in a very difficult way, and where there's very little bandwidth for that because of the moment of crisis and apocalyptic war that we're in. There's very little bandwidth to accommodate the sort of conversations that need to be held. But certainly in terms of safety as a racialized minority outside of Europe, outside of Israel, where Jewish people live as a minoritized community in societies where, you know, anti-Semitism is part of the social fabric and architecture and has been for hundreds of years. What does that mean? I don't think it's possible to engage with that unless we reconnect anti-Semitism to a broader anti-racist struggle and see it as part and parcel of the same thing. I don't think that, you know, the way that the progressive response to anti-Semitism has not been adequate. It's not been morally coherent. It has not been integrated with anti-racism. And, you know, until the progressive left reclaims that space, which at the moment is populated with right-wing voices, which is extreme, you know, also doesn't do anything to tackle anti-Semitism, if anything, the opposite, right? So there's something about a reclamation of that space of fighting anti-Semitism that needs to happen, and a reconnection of anti-Semitism and an understanding of it and the way it has operated in Europe and continues to operate. There's I think, a vital reconnection with that and tackling it as part of anti-racism that has been absent, or certainly needs to happen more than has been the case thus far.
I've asked you this question earlier on, and I mean, you rightly said you don't know, and I'm just gonna push on it a bit more and rephrase it a bit more. But given what's happening with the war and its brutality and what it means for Palestine and for Israel and so many things, if you could look fast forward 10 years into the future, what do you think this looks like? What do you think the war is ended by then? Do you think there's different borders? Do you think there's a greater Israel? Do you think there's a two-state solution implemented of some sort? Like, just what would be your guess when you just look at the devastation, the way Israel's conducting its war? What do you think would be the likely outcome of this? It doesn't have to be 10 years, 5 years, whatever it may be.
It's really hard to address that in a moment when so many people are dealing with the effect of this decimation. And I am not hopeful. I do not feel hopeful about the future for that region, for Palestinians in Gaza, for Palestinians in, you know, occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, in Israel itself. I do not feel hopeful for Jewish Israelis either. I think all of this is very bad and is not going anywhere good anytime soon. And at the same time, I cannot um, I cannot be anything other than a sort of determined hope for future generations living in that region. I will not consign them to my despair, right? And so I have to imagine a scenario where we do keep pushing for a better reality for everybody in that region. And that reality has to embrace the idea that everybody in that region is deserving of equity, equal citizenship, whatever construct that takes, justice, and a process of reconciliation, because I do not see how we get to anything good before, as I said before, it's not just Jewish Israelis, it's a Western reckoning with what actually has happened in the last, over a year. You have to have some kind of acknowledgement of what has taken place before we can even begin to think about moving forward.
Just last question. Those people who do read your book, what's the one thing that you'd want them to come out out from it? What's the one takeaway that you want them to have?
I think the one thing that I would love to happen is for us to engage in a very different conversation about anti-Semitism and how it correlates and how we talk about different racisms, because at the moment it's not only siloed, but everyone is competitive, and that's because it's set up to be. The media and political conversation about racism has set it up as a competing hierarchy, and so I guess for me, the idea that we all need to engage in a different conversation about this, because we need one that can support us all. We need one that can honor and see and hold us all with that difference and a different understanding of how those racisms play out. But unless we do that, we don't stand a chance of being able to stand together, of being able to unite, and being able to resist and reject the overwhelmingly sort of nativist right-wing narratives that currently are overwhelming us.
Rachel Shabi, thank you so much.
Thank you.